I'm Tega Brain, and I'm an artist with a background in environmental engineering. I'm based in Brooklyn, but from Australia. And my work addresses the way that technologies inform how we see and understand environmental systems. I often make experimental infrastructures that try to reconfigure like everyday technologies to address different sets of values so that they operate with a different politics. How do we sort of design our technologies in ways that acknowledge that we're part of, multi-species worlds, and that we're entangled in all of these, relationships with other species and other entities. I think historically there's been a tendency to talk about a shift to more sustainable energy systems, for example, through the lens of like austerity or through the lens of giving things up. And clearly that hasn't worked, right? So I think there's a lot of work to be done by artists, storytellers, creatives to tell different stories about the transformations and the amazing possibilities that come out of them. Artists really are able to experiment and play and apply emerging technologies in really diverse ways for use cases that are really specific, that address like particular obsessions we might have, or the needs of like one person or a really small group of people. So you get this like diversity of applications that isn't really possible in an engineering context where you're designing at scale, right? Engineers design infrastructure and it's all about designing systems that scale. And as an artist, we don't have to do that. So that creates this like freedom to be able to really like play with emerging technologies. If you look at art history, there's a lot of lines of thinking and lines of work that explore failure and glitch and moments where technologies don't work. Uselessness is such an important thing in the history of art. And so taking those sorts of experiments and those sorts of histories and thinking and using them to sort of experiment with emerging technologies is really productive for kind of breaking the expectations we have of those systems. So much of my work has explored like experimental infrastructure systems. So often I'll build like installations that take a sort of everyday piece of infrastructure like a laundromat or a Wi-Fi network, and I'll try to like redesign them so that different things are prioritized in the system. Because I like to think about infrastructures as, rather than thinking about them as like services where human needs are centered and prioritized above everything else, what if we thought about them as like negotiations with other species and negotiations with the environment we live in? So if we think about them as connections, if we think about them as negotiations, then how would we design them differently? These sort of open source creative coding tools are really interesting for like the collaborative development of technologies, to think about like different sort of ownership models like that, for example, but also like, what do platforms look like that might be based on the model of ownership that's a co-op, right, rather than a corporation. Those creative coding communities are really heavily supported by institutions. Part of this is also like really defending like institutions like that and public support for research. And I know that's like kind of a boring answer to this question, but like if we look at what's happened around the world in the last decades, right, there's been defunding of like public research, public education, the university sector, everywhere. Like, I mean, in Australia, this is happening really dramatically just this year. And I think that really means that you're limiting how technologies can be developed, because it means that people have to go and do it in the private sector rather than through a model that allows for more sort of collaborative, open source practices.